Imagine you are, the most famous intellectual in the world.
Oh, setting the bar high right away.
Right. I mean, you have 3,000 top-tier students hanging on your every syllable. You've got millions in the bank, and you have the direct ear of the emperor. You are the ultimate authority.
Well, you've essentially won the game of life at that point.
Exactly. Then, one morning in the year 1095, you step up to the podium in, the most prestigious lecture hall on earth. You open your mouth to deliver your brilliant insights, and absolutely nothing comes out.
Just completely silent.
Yeah, your vocal cords have completely shut down.
It is a terrifying scenario, not just losing your voice, but, losing the very instrument that built your entire empire.
And today's deep dive is getting into exactly that scenario, which actually happens to be one of the most debated psychological mysteries in recorded history.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at the sudden, shocking, mid-career disappearance of Al-Ghazālī. Now, for those who might not know, Al-Ghazālī was arguably the most brilliant Muslim thinker, theologian, and supreme jurist of the 11th century.
A total heavyweight.
Yeah. And we are synthesizing some incredible sources today. Specifically, Mohammed Hosein's critical academic paper on Al-Ghazālī's crisis, along with Al-Ghazālī's own famous autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal.
Which translates to deliverance from error for the English readers.
Right.
And these sources are phenomenal because they read less like a dry historical record and much more like, a high-stakes psychological thriller.
Totally.
We have missing fortunes, secret escapes, political assassinations, and a massive internal breakdown.
And our mission for you, the listener, is to help us parse the evidence and solve this 800-year-old debate. Was Al-Ghazālī's sudden dramatic departure driven by a very real, terrifying external political threat?
Or was it a profound internal crisis of the heart?
Exactly, because the context of his exit is just wild. We are talking about a man at the absolute pinnacle of his society who just walks away from it all and disappears off the grid for a decade.
A full 10 years.
Yeah. I really want you to consider what it would fundamentally take for you to abandon your entire life's work at the exact moment of your greatest success.
It defies conventional logic, which is exactly why historians have fought over his motivations for centuries now.
Right.
But to truly understand the sheer gravity of his exit, we really have to establish the mechanics of the world he was operating in. We need to look at what he was actually walking away from.
So build that world for us.
Huh.
Who is Al-Ghazālī in 1095? And what is the geopolitical reality of his life in Baghdad?
Okay, so we are in the late 11th century, inside the immensely powerful Seljuk Empire. Al-Ghazālī was born in 1058 in a small Persian village, coming from a very, very modest background.
Real humble beginnings.
Exactly. But he possessed a once-in-a-generation staggering intellect. His rise is just meteoric. By 1091, his genius catches the eye of the Seljuk wazir, Nizam al-Mulk.
Let's pause there for a second because wazir can sound like a slightly vague historical title to some. In the context of the Seljuk Empire, what kind of power does a wazir actually wield?
Ah, right. So think of a wazir as basically the prime minister, the chief of staff, and the head of the military all rolled into one.
Oh, wow. So, serious influence.
Oh, absolutely. The sultan might technically hold the crown, but Nizam al-Mulk was the guy actually running the empire day to day. And this immensely powerful man appoints Al-Ghazālī as a star professor at the prestigious Nizamiya College in Baghdad.
So this is essentially like medieval Harvard, Oxford, and MIT combined right at the center of the intellectual universe.
Perfectly said. And Al-Ghazālī wasn't just a tenured faculty member there. He was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the campus. He routinely had up to 3,000 students attending his lectures.
3,000 students for an 11th century lecture. That's a stadium crowd.
It's massive. But his influence went way beyond academia. He was issuing supreme legal rulings. He was the ideological defender of the Sunni state, and he was publicly dismantling the arguments of rival sects.
So he's not just locked in an ivory tower.
No, not at all. He is a public intellectual with immense, tangible, real-world power.
Okay, so he has arrived. He has won it all. But then we hit this fateful year, 1095. He is 37 years old at the absolute height of his dominance, and he is struck by this bizarre affliction.
Right.
He literally loses the ability to speak, and then he loses the ability to eat or even digest food.
The physical breakdown is rapid, and it's severe. And what makes this really fascinating is the medical response to it.
Because they brought in the experts, right?
Yeah, Baghdad at this time had some of the most advanced medical minds in the world. They were inheriting and expanding upon Greek and Persian medicine. So the best physicians are brought in to examine the most important intellectual in the empire.
No pressure on those doctors, by the way.
Right. But after thorough examinations, they come to a really startling conclusion. They determine it is not a physical ailment at all. They diagnose it as a psychological condition, basically an affliction of the soul. And crucially, they admit there's absolutely no medical cure for it.
That is a massive admission for elite doctors to make. I mean, they essentially throw their hands up and say, look, we can't bleed this out of you. We can't give you a tincture. This is happening in a place our scalpels can't reach.
Exactly. And shortly after this really dire prognosis, Al-Ghazālī announces to the public that he is leaving Baghdad to perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca.
Which sounds completely reasonable for a sick religious scholar.
On the surface, sure. But the sources reveal that behind the scenes, he is executing a highly calculated exit strategy. He secretly gives away his vast wealth.
Just unloads all of it.
Yep. He sets up a carefully managed trust fund to ensure his family is provided for. He installs his brother Ahmad to take over his prestigious teaching post, and then he just vanishes.
And he doesn't even go to Mecca right away, does he?
No. He diverts to Syria and drops completely out of public life.
Which brings up a massive logistical question for me. How does a guy with 3,000 devoted students and the full backing of the empire just slip out the back door?
It takes serious planning.
Right. It sounds like he essentially had to fake his itinerary so his own followers wouldn't, physically barricade the city gates to keep him there.
Oh, he absolutely knew they wouldn't let him go. He was too vital to the political and religious establishment. I mean, his intellectual output was essentially a matter of state security.
And naturally, when the most famous mind in the empire goes mute and flees town under the guise of pilgrimage, the rumor mill is going to go into absolute overdrive.
You can only imagine the gossip.
Yeah, if the doctors couldn't find a tumor or a poison, the public mind immediately jumps to external forces. People assumed someone or some group had gotten to him.
Which perfectly sets up the central historical debate we need to tackle today. Was he running towards something spiritual, or was he running away from something highly dangerous?
Right. And for a large camp of modern historians, the answer is definitively the latter. They argue he was running for his life.
Yeah, the political assassin theory.
Let's hear the case for it, because on the surface, I have to admit, it sounds like a very compelling Hollywood script.
It really does, yeah. If you read prominent Western historians, like Duncan B. MacDonald, or later scholars like Fareed Jabre and Arif Tamer, they push this prevailing theory that Al-Ghazālī fled Baghdad in sheer, unadulterated terror.
Okay, but why? Who is he afraid of?
Well, to understand why they think this, you have to look at the volatility of the political climate at that exact moment. Remember his powerful patron, the Wazir Nizam al-Mulk.
The prime minister figure who got him the prestigious job.
Exactly. Well, just a short time before Al-Ghazālī's crisis, Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he wasn't killed by a random criminal. The prevailing historical consensus is that he was murdered by the Ismaili assassins.
And we should definitely clarify who the Ismaili assassins were, because this wasn't just a group of street thugs.
Not at all. They were a highly organized, very secretive political and religious faction engaging in brutal asymmetrical warfare.
Right, like an 11th century covert ops group.
Essentially, yes. They were actively trying to destabilize the Sunni Seljuk Empire by systematically murdering its top political and military leaders. So historians argue that Al-Ghazālī, as the intellectual face and primary propagandist of the Sunni establishment, realized he was next on their hit list.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Because if I am putting myself in Al-Ghazālī's shoes, if my incredibly powerful, heavily guarded boss gets murdered by a shadow syndicate of trained killers, I am absolutely booking the next flight out of town.
It seems like the only rational move.
Right. It is totally logical to assume my life is in danger. Why shouldn't we just trust the obvious, most pragmatic answer here? His quote-unquote illness was just a massive panic attack, and the pilgrimage was a convenient cover story to throw a team of assassins off his scent.
I get it. It sounds incredibly pragmatic until you actually look at the specific actions he took after he left.
Okay, I'm listening.
The sources we are pulling from systematically dismantled this historical gossip. When you scrutinize the actual timeline, the assassin theory develops massive, glaring holes.
All right, lay out the evidence for us. How do the sources disprove the political fear theory?
Well, first, let's look at his writings. If you are genuinely terrified of a covert group of political assassins, what is the absolute last thing you would do?
draw attention to myself. I certainly wouldn't actively provoke them.
Exactly. You'd keep your head down. Yet, the sources note that Al-Ghazālī wrote 5 more major tracts explicitly attacking the Ismailis after he left the supposed safety of Baghdad.
Wait, really? 5 more.
5 more.
Oh, wow. So he is effectively continuing the ideological war while completely unprotected out on the road. I mean, if you are in witness protection hiding from the mob, you don't keep publishing op-eds insulting the mob boss.
It makes zero sense if he was hiding. And furthermore, look at his travel itinerary. He leaves Baghdad and eventually settles in Syria.
Okay, what's wrong with Syria?
Syria at this time had a massive, heavy Ismaili influence. If you are running from assassins, you do not voluntarily relocate to a region where they have deep networks and strongholds.
Yeah, that completely contradicts the idea of a man trying to lay low. And actually, Hosian's paper brings up this phenomenal anecdote from Al-Ghazālī's youth that gives us a real window into his baseline psychology.
Oh, the bandit story. I love this one.
Well, it tells you everything you need to know about how he handles fear. So when he was a young student, he was traveling with a caravan that got ambushed by violent highway bandits.
Right, and they steal all his belongings.
Everything, including his precious, meticulously written lecture notes.
Now, a normal person cedes the notes and is just happy they survived the ambush.
But what does Al-Ghazālī do? He doesn't cower. He doesn't run away. He literally marches right up to the leader of these heavily armed bandits, looks him in the eye, and demands his notebooks back.
It's so bold.
He essentially tells the bandit, "Take the money, but give me back my knowledge."
And the bandit actually mocks him, saying, "What good is your knowledge if I can just steal it from you in a notebook?"
But he gives the notes back.
He does. The point of the story is that it demonstrates a fundamental, almost reckless bravery in his character.
Wow.
This is not a man who fundamentally turns and runs at the first sign of physical danger. He confronts it head on.
And if we look at the logistics of his departure in 1095, the way he handled his brother Ahmad is kind of the final nail in the coffin for the assassin theory.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, think about the mechanics of this. If you are fleeing a city in terror because trained killers are actively hunting your prominent family, why on earth would you leave your own brother in your highly visible, completely exposed public teaching post?
You wouldn't. You'd be leaving your brother as a sitting duck. It makes absolutely no sense. If the threat was external, he would have rushed his entire family out of the city in the dead of night.
Right.
But his exit was methodical. He took the time to set up complex financial trusts. The fear of external political assassins simply doesn't fit his well-documented psychological profile, and it fundamentally contradicts his logistical actions.
So if we completely rule out the assassins, we are left with a pretty terrifying vacuum. The most powerful intellectual in Baghdad wasn't chased out by men with daggers.
No, he wasn't.
Which means if the threat wasn't lurking in the shadows of the city, we are forced to look inward. The real assassin was operating entirely inside Al-Ghazālī's own mind.
Which brings us to the actual core of the mystery. What was happening inside him that was violent enough to physically shut down his body?
Yeah, what triggers that?
To understand this, we have to rely on his own incredibly candid words in his autobiography, Al-Munqidh. And here, the sources ask us to make a really crucial, nuanced distinction.
Yes, the difference between an epistemological crisis, which is a crisis of the mind, and what he experienced in 1095, which was a crisis of the heart.
Right.
Break down that difference for us, because he had actually survived a crisis of the mind earlier in his life, hadn't he?
He did. In his youth, Al-Ghazālī experienced a profound philosophical breakdown. An epistemological crisis is essentially a complete collapse of your trust in reality.
Like doubting everything you know.
Exactly. He began to deeply doubt his own senses. He wrote about how you can look at a shadow, and your eyes tell you the shadow is perfectly still. But logic dictates that as the sun moves, the shadow must be moving.
Right, so your eyes are lying.
So his senses were lying to him. He then began to doubt logic itself, wondering if there was some higher state of consciousness that would eventually prove logic wrong, just like logic proved his eyes wrong.
That sounds like an intense 11th century existential dread, like questioning if you are living in the Matrix.
It really is. He doubted everything. But that crisis lasted about 2 months, and he cured it. He found a bedrock of truth and rebuilt his intellectual framework.
Okay, but 1095 was different.
Completely different. The crisis in 1095 wasn't about doubting the fabric of reality. It was a crisis of the heart. It was a terrifying, undeniable moment of self-awareness.
He realized he was a fraud.
He realized he was a hypocrite. He looked at his life, his 3,000 adoring students, his proximity to the emperor, his immense wealth. And he writes that he saw he was immersed in attachments, which had encompassed him from all sides.
Wow.
He scrutinized his own intentions and realized that his brilliant teaching, his debates, his complex writings, none of it was actually motivated by a pure devotion to God or truth. It was entirely motivated by a quest for fame and widespread prestige.
He says in the book he felt he was on the brink of a crumbling bank about to fall into the fire.
Yeah.
I really want you, the listener, to internalize that realization. It's like severe burnout crossed with profound imposter syndrome, but elevated to an existential spiritual life or death scenario.
That's a great way to put it.
It wasn't just that he was working too hard. It was this terrifying realization that his entire identity, the very foundation of his greatness, was completely rotten. It was all a performance for his ego.
And what is so deeply fascinating about this specific crisis is how his own intellectual brilliance was actually his trap.
How so? I mean, if he is so smart, shouldn't he just be able to reason his way out of it?
See, that is exactly the problem. As the supreme master jurist and theologian, he knew all the theories. He knew exactly what a pure heart and a sincere intention looked like on paper.
He had the textbook definition.
Right.
Yeah.
He could diagnose his own spiritual sickness perfectly. He didn't need a physician to tell him his soul was diseased. He was literally the greatest expert on the subject in the world.
Okay, I see.
But knowing the cure and actually taking it are two completely different mechanisms.
It's the difference between being a master mechanic who can write a textbook on how a car engine works and actually being willing to get your hands covered in grease to fix your own broken transmission.
Exactly. He had the theory, but he lacked the will.
Yeah.
And that paralyzing gap between theory and action is what shut his body down. Psychologically, his body turned off his speech because speech was his primary weapon of vanity.
Oh, that is profound.
Right. If your ego is entirely fed by the sound of your own voice, lecturing to thousands, your subconscious literally cuts the microphone. His inability to speak or eat was the physical manifestation of an intense internal war.
His ego's desire for worldly success was battling his soul's demand for authenticity.
Exactly.
So he was completely stuck. I mean, giving up that level of prestige is agonizing. So he is trapped in this psychosomatic paralysis. But he obviously doesn't stay paralyzed forever. He eventually leaves.
He does.
What were the specific catalysts? What actually broke the dam and forced him to move?
The sources highlight two major catalysts that finally shattered his intellectual armor. The first catalyst was actually operating right inside his own family, his brother, Ahmad.
The one he eventually left his job to.
Yes. While Al-Ghazālī was the hyper-logical academic superstar, Ahmad was a famous Sufi wadiz.
Which is essentially a spiritual preacher, right? Someone who
Yeah.
speaks directly to the emotions rather than just debating dense legal theory.
Exactly. And Ahmad's sermons were legendary in Baghdad. They were visceral. He would speak about the afterlives and the fleeting nature of worldly wealth, and he routinely made grown men openly weep and repent in the streets.
I have to point out, as someone who reads Al-Ghazālī's incredibly dense logical philosophy, having a younger brother who does exactly what you do, but gets these massive, raw emotional results, must have driven him absolutely crazy.
Oh, it had to have created a profound cognitive dissonance. Ahmad was constantly publicly reminding Al-Ghazālī about the temporal nature of his fame. Those constant emotional reminders from his own blood really chipped away at his pride.
But there was a second catalyst, right?
Yes, and it was even more dramatic. It's an incredible historical scene from 1093 involving the visit of a famous Sufi mystic named Al-Abadi.
The numbers in the sources for this event are staggering. They record that 30,000 people attended Al-Abadi's gatherings in Baghdad.
30,000. And the reaction of the crowd wasn't just like polite applause. It was a mass social upheaval.
What were they doing?
Citizens were literally bringing out their expensive wine and spilling it in the streets. They were breaking their musical instruments, which, by the way, were symbols of elite, forbidden party culture.
Right.
They were weeping in mass repentance. Seeing this raw, transformative, chaotic spiritual power firsthand fundamentally changed Al-Ghazālī.
Let's look at the mechanics of that contrast. Al-Ghazālī is giving these brilliant, perfectly structured, logical lectures to 3,000 elite students who are, dutifully taking notes.
Very orderly.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Al-Ghazālī rolls into town and 30,000 people are radically physically changing their lives on the spot. It must have made Al-Ghazālī realize, I have all the intellectual theory of religion, but this guy has the actual functional spiritual power.
That is the exact mechanism that broke him.
Mm.
Sufism, in this context, is experiential versus theoretical.
Hmm.
Al-Ghazālī realized you cannot think your way to a pure heart.
You can't just intellectualize it.
No, you have to experience the detachment. And this leads to his ultimate cure. He writes in his autobiography that it was divine inspiration that finally made it easy for him to detach.
After months of agonizing paralysis.
Yes, he finally surrendered his ego.
He finally got his hands dirty and fixed his own transmission.
He did. He followed the precedent of past Sufi masters, men like Al-Muhasibi and Al-Shibli, who had also renounced powerful worldly positions to save their own souls. This wasn't a tragic mental breakdown that ended his usefulness to society.
No, definitely not.
This 10-year exile was the necessary crucible.
And we know it was fruitful because it was during this exact exile, this decade of deep spiritual retreat and anonymity, that he wrote his absolute masterpiece, the Ihya Ulum al-Din.
Revival of the religious sciences.
Right, a book that fundamentally changed Islamic thought forever. He could never have written it if he had stayed comfortable in that plush corner office in Baghdad.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The Ihya is powerful precisely because it is infused with the authenticity of a man who actually walked the walk. He didn't just theorize about giving up the world. He actually did it.
I want to point out something really brilliant about the logistics of how he left, too. We mentioned earlier that he left his brother, Ahmad, the emotional spiritual preacher, to take over his teaching spot.
Yep.
That wasn't just a convenient family favor. That was a highly intentional, subtle lesson directed right at his students.
Oh, I see where you're going.
He was essentially telling them, you have become far too intellectual, too arrogant under my leadership. You need to be brought back down to earth. You need the spiritual medicine that my brother has.
It was his final, silent lecture before he disappeared. And I think this raises a deeply important question for you, the person listening to this right now.
Yeah. How does this apply to us?
Think about your own life. When you feel stuck or paralyzed or unfulfilled, are you trying to solve a crisis of the heart with a crisis of the mind solution? Are you trying to aggressively outthink or intellectualize a flaw that actually requires you to just let go of your ego and change your behavior?
That hits incredibly close to home. I mean, we all love to intellectualize our flaws because it makes us feel like we are working on them without actually having to endure the pain of changing our habits.
Exactly. It's safe.
So, to pull all of these threads together, the sources show us that Al-Ghazālī did not flee Baghdad under the cover of night because of political assassins. He wasn't running from the shadowy Ismailis.
No, he wasn't.
He was fleeing from the suffocating weight of his own ego. His physical paralysis, the sudden inability to speak or eat, was the psychosomatic result of a profound internal war between his vanity and his soul.
Perfectly summarized.
And having the courage to walk away from absolute power led to one of the most famous and fruitful spiritual retreats in human history.
It really did. And, you know, if we step back and connect this historical debate to our modern perspective, I want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Look at how eager modern historians were to invent a complex political conspiracy. I mean, this elaborate narrative of fleeing assassins just to explain his departure.
Yeah, they really clung to it.
They bent over backward to find a violent external reason, rather than simply believing that a man could genuinely walk away from fame, wealth, and power just to save his own conscience.
If you look at the evidence today, it's easy to see why we assume it was a political cover-up. We do this all the time with modern celebrity or political scandals. We automatically assume there's a cynical PR spin behind every action. We literally cannot comprehend someone voluntarily giving up status.
Exactly. What does it say about the baseline cynicism of our own society today, that we find a violent, shadowy political conspiracy to be a much more believable explanation than a human being having a genuine crisis of the heart?
That is a phenomenal point to end on. It tells us that sometimes, when the historical narrative is murky, the confusion isn't actually about the subject at all. Sometimes, the inability to see the simple spiritual truth is entirely a reflection of the cynicism of the people looking back at it. Keep diving deep, everyone.